In February of 1986, a young nurse was found dead in her Los Angeles apartment, in what police called a burglary gone wrong. For 23 years, that's exactly what it stayed, a cold case, a closed drawer, a family waiting for answers that never came. Then, in 2009, a lab technician retested a single piece of evidence the original detectives never had the technology to read, a bite mark on the victim's arm. The DNA inside it didn't match a stranger. It didn't match a burglar at all. It matched someone who had walked the halls of the Los Angeles Police Department for over 2 decades, someone who, for years, had access to the very case file built to catch her. This is the story of Sherri Rasmussen, and the 23 years it took to find out who really killed her. Sherri Rasmussen was 29 years old, and by every account, she had built exactly the life she set out to build. She became a registered nurse in her early 20s and rose fast. Within a few years, she was named Director of Nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, one of the youngest people ever to hold that position there. She also taught as a clinical instructor at UCLA, training the next generation of nurses on her own time. Colleagues remembered her as meticulous and driven, the kind of person who double-checked everything not out of anxiety, but out of care for the people in her charge. Friends described a woman who loved to travel, who kept a tidy, sunlit apartment in Van Nuys, and who had just married an aerospace engineer named John Rutan after a courtship of several years. They'd been married 3 months. She was, by every measure available to the people who knew her, exactly where she wanted to be in life. But that same engagement had a shadow to it. Before Sherri and John married, John had dated another woman for years, on and off, seriously enough that people assumed they'd end up together. That relationship had ended. Sherri and John's had begun. And in the months before the wedding, that former girlfriend contacted Sherri directly, more than once, making clear she didn't accept that it was over. Sherri, by her family's account, wasn't the type to be intimidated easily. She confronted the situation directly and told people close to her about it. She had no way of knowing that the woman she was describing carried a badge and a gun for a living. On the morning of February 24, 1986, Sherri went to work as usual. Co-workers said she seemed happy. She and John had only been married since November, and they were still settling into their new apartment together. Sometime that afternoon, she came home alone. John was still at his office. When he returned that evening, he found the apartment in disarray, drawers pulled open, items scattered, and Sherri dead on the living room floor. She had been shot 3 times. Investigators also found signs of a struggle, a bite mark on her forearm, and defensive injuries consistent with someone who had fought back hard against an attacker. The scene, on its surface, looked like exactly what detectives concluded it was, a burglary that a resident had walked in on, and that had turned violent. There were problems with that theory from the start. Nothing of real value was actually taken. A television and other easily sold items were left untouched. And the level of violence, 3 gunshots, a fight serious enough to leave bite mark evidence, didn't read like a burglar surprised mid-robbery. It read like rage directed at a specific person. Still, the case was filed as a robbery homicide. Detectives pursued a couple of tips, found nothing solid, and within a matter of months, the file went quiet. Sherri's parents didn't accept that explanation. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen believed, from the very beginning, that this had been personal, that someone their daughter knew, not a stranger off the street, had done this to her. They pushed the department for updates for years. For years, there was almost nothing to tell them. The file didn't move for over 2 decades. Not because no one cared, but because in 1986, the technology that would eventually crack this case simply didn't exist yet. The bite mark on Sherri's arm had been swabbed and preserved. Nobody in that room could have known that the answer was already sitting in an evidence locker, waiting for science to catch up. In 2005, the LAPD opened a dedicated cold case unit, and Sherri's file was one of thousands pulled for review. Detectives resubmitted the preserved bite mark swab for DNA testing, a technique that hadn't existed in any usable form back in 1986. The result, returned in 2009, was a clean, female DNA profile. That alone reshaped the entire case. This likely hadn't been a male burglar at all. The person who fought with Sherri Rasmussen in her final minutes was a woman. Detectives ran the profile against California's offender database. Nothing came back. Whoever this was, she had no criminal record on file. With the database search a dead end, investigators went back to the original 1986 file, the leads detectives had gathered at the time but never fully pursued. Buried in the notes was a detail Sherri's parents had mentioned from the very beginning, a woman who had confronted their daughter before the wedding, upset about losing John Rutan. A woman detectives in 1986 had briefly looked at, and then let go, without ever collecting so much as a fingerprint. Investigators tracked her down. She was no longer a private citizen living an ordinary life. She was a working detective, still employed by the same police department investigating this murder. You cannot simply walk up to a fellow officer and ask for a DNA sample based on a 23-year-old hunch. So investigators did something quieter. They followed her, off-duty, to a Costco store, and after she left, they recovered a piece of discarded chewing gum and a soda cup she had thrown away. That discarded saliva sample went to the lab under surveillance, tested against the swab preserved since 1986. It was a match. The woman whose DNA matched the 23-year-old bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen's arm was Detective Stephanie Lazarus, a 25-year veteran of the Los Angeles Police Department, still actively serving at the time of her arrest. For over 2 decades, the person responsible for Sherri's death had wielded a badge inside the very institution tasked with catching her. She had access to internal systems. She could have learned, at almost any point, exactly how close, or how far, investigators were from the truth. Before the murder, according to the case record, she had confronted Sherri directly, warning her to stay away from John Rutan. Weeks later, Sherri was dead. Stephanie Lazarus was arrested in 2009 and charged with first-degree murder. Her trial began in 2012, more than a quarter-century after Sherri's death. Prosecutors laid out the DNA match, the bite mark, the confrontation before the wedding, and the original detective's testimony about how quickly, and how thinly, the case had been investigated the first time around. The defense argued the relationship had ended amicably years earlier and that the DNA evidence had chain-of-custody problems from decades of storage. The jury didn't agree. In March 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder. She was sentenced to 27 years to life in prison. Sherri's parents, Nels and Loretta, who had spent 23 years pushing for this exact outcome, were in the courtroom to hear the verdict. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just how long it took to solve. It's that for 23 years, the answer wasn't hiding in some unreachable place. It was inside the same institution built to find it. Sherri Rasmussen's case wasn't cracked by a lucky break or a confession. It was cracked because DNA science eventually caught up to a piece of evidence collected in 1986, evidence that outlasted every excuse, every closed door, and every year that passed without her name being said out loud in a courtroom. If this kind of case, where the truth is buried in plain sight for decades, is the reason you're here, subscribe to Crimson Ledger. We're only getting started.